There is something we have forgotten about surviving extreme cold. February 2021. Texas. The power grid collapses. Temperatures plunge to -2 degrees Fahrenheit. That's -19 Celsius. Millions of homes go dark. Within hours, families are huddling under blankets in freezing houses. 4.5 million customers without power, some for days. Over the following days, hundreds die. Some from carbon monoxide poisoning using improvised heaters, others from hypothermia in homes that became iceboxes, many from preventable causes that wouldn't have happened with reliable heat. But 800 years ago, a medieval peasant in the Scottish Highlands faced -30 degrees Fahrenheit, -34 Celsius. No power grid to fail, no natural gas pipeline, no emergency services coming to rescue them. They didn't just survive, they stayed warm through months of brutal cold, using nothing but what they dug from the ground. The fuel was peat, the forgotten fossil fuel that heated Europe for 1,000 years, a material most people today have never even heard of. What made it so effective? Why did it work when modern systems catastrophically fail? And what does this ancient knowledge reveal about the fragility of everything we depend on? Hit subscribe if you want the full answer. What you're about to learn works in any crisis. Let's get into it. Section 1. The fuel that powered medieval Europe. Peat is not wood, and it's not coal. It exists somewhere in between. Formed in waterlogged bogs and marshes, peat is partially decomposed plant matter, mosses, grasses and sedges, dead vegetation that doesn't fully rot because it's submerged in water. No oxygen means no complete decomposition. Layer upon layer accumulates incredibly slowly, just 1 millimeter per year, which means a 3-meter deep layer represents 3,000 years of accumulated plant matter. This is ancient carbon, locked away for millennia. When you burn peat, you're releasing energy stored during the Bronze Age. Medieval peasants didn't understand the chemistry, but they understood results, and the results were extraordinary. In regions without forests, Ireland, Finland, Scotland, the Netherlands, northern England and Russia, peat was everything. Across the wetlands of northern Europe, peat was the primary fuel for heating and cooking. The numbers reveal the scale. Norwich Cathedral in England consumed 400,000 peat blocks every single year. Over the 14th and 15th centuries, more than 80 million peat blocks were burned just to heat one building. In areas where both peat and wood were available, people chose peat. Why? Less labour to harvest. 4 to 5 men could cut enough peat in one day to keep a family warm through an entire Irish winter. The Dutch took this further. From 1625 to 1700, Dutch shipyards produced 500 ships per year, many commissioned by foreign powers. They used sophisticated wind-powered sawmills for cutting wood, but peat provided thermal energy for bending planks, melting tar, and forging iron fittings. This created a brilliant economic strategy. Peat handled all thermal needs, so every piece of imported wood became construction material instead of fuel. This generated far higher return on investment and made the Dutch less vulnerable to volatile wood prices. Peat was not a backup fuel. It was the primary heating system for entire civilizations. But why did it work so well in extreme cold? The answer lies in how it burns. Section 2. The science of slow burning. When you light a log on fire, it burns hot and fast. Flames leap, heat pours out. Within 2 to 3 hours, it's ash. Peat doesn't burn like this. Peat smolders. It's flameless combustion that's slow, persistent, and relentless. The energy density is comparable to wood. Dried peat delivers about the same energy as seasoned hardwood, roughly 7,000 BTUs per pound, but it delivers that energy completely differently. When peat ignites, it enters a unique combustion state. Peak temperatures reach only 500 to 700 degrees Celsius, 900 to 1300 Fahrenheit, much lower than flaming wood, which hits 800 to 1100 Celsius. But here is where peat becomes superior. The structure of peat minimizes heat loss. Despite relatively low temperature, combustion is highly persistent. The spread rate is glacially slow, 1 to 10 centimeters per hour, about 1 millimeter per minute, 2 orders of magnitude slower than flame spread. This is not a bug. It's the feature that saved lives. In -30 degrees, you cannot afford for fire to go out. Restarting a fire with numb hands and frozen tinder can take 15 to 30 minutes, nearly the time you don't have when hypothermia is minutes away. Peat solves this. Once lit, it doesn't quit. The smouldering combustion can persist for 12 to 24 hours without any attention. No adding fuel, no stoking, just constant, reliable heat. Modern fire science has studied this extensively. Properly dried peat can smoulder for days, even weeks. Researchers have documented peat fires burning underground for months, surviving rain, snow, and attempts to extinguish them. Medieval peasants couldn't explain the chemistry, but they observed the outcome. Peat gave them something wood never could, absolute reliability, and they developed techniques to maximize this property. Techniques that modern science now validates as thermally sound. Section 3. The medieval peat system. The medieval approach to peat heating was not random. It was refined through centuries of harsh winters and failed experiments. Harvesting began in spring, after winter snow melted, but before summer growth. The top layer of living vegetation was removed. This wasn't waste. It became turf for quick cooking fires. Beneath the surface layer was the real prize, dark, compressed peat. The deeper you went, the denser and older the material. Peasants used specialized tools, a peat spade with a wing at right angles that cut neat blocks. Uniform size mattered for consistency in drying and burning. Fresh-cut peat is 90% water minus completely useless as fuel. The drying process was critical. Blocks were laid out in formations, stacked to allow air circulation on all sides, and left for 1 to 2 weeks. Then they had to be turned, restacked, and dried for another 2 to 4 weeks. During this time, moisture content dropped from 90% to 30 or 40%. At this moisture level, the calorific value reaches about 10 megajoules per kilogram. Dry enough to burn efficiently, but not so dry it burns too fast. Storage was deliberate. Peat stacks were built near the house, but not against it, covered with thatch, mundled straw and reeds to shed rain, and ventilated to prevent mould. Inside the home, the peat fire occupied the central hearth. In the earliest medieval homes, this was an open fire pit in the middle of the room, with smoke escaping through a hole in the roof. Later designs added chimneys, but the principle remained binary: the hearth never went cold. The technique for maintaining continuous heat was called banking. Before sleep, when the peat had burned down to glowing coals, peasants covered them with a layer of peat ash, 2 to 3 inches deep. Ash has low thermal conductivity, so it insulates and restricts oxygen flow. The result? Coals smoulder at 400 to 500 degrees under the ash blanket. Not enough oxygen to flame, not cool enough to extinguish. A perfect stasis. 12 hours later, a peasant would push aside the ash. Underneath, those coals would still glow red-orange. Add a few small pieces of dried peat, blow gently, and within seconds, combustion resumed. No flint, no steel, no struggling in the freezing pre-dawn darkness. Modern tests validate this technique works with precision. Colonial Williamsburg Foundation uses ash banking daily in their historical demonstrations. Their record is 31 hours, a Thursday evening fire, revived on Saturday morning with the same coals. But peat offered one more advantage that wood couldn't match: complete thermal efficiency through mass. A 10-pound block, about 4.5 kilograms, burning in the hearth, releases heat continuously for 8 to 12 hours. But peasants discovered you could do more. They placed additional peat blocks around the hearth, not in the fire, but beside it. The radiant heat slowly warmed these blocks. By evening, they were hot, not glowing, but storing thermal energy. At bedtime, these warm blocks were wrapped in wool and tucked into beds, placed at the foot to warm feet, against the abdomen to warm the core. A Norwegian study tested this exact method using period-accurate materials. A peat block heated to 150 degrees Fahrenheit minus 65 Celsius and properly wrapped maintained usable warmth above 100 degrees for 6 to 8 hours. A full night of sleep. This is thermal battery technology, 1,500 years before modern phase-change materials. The peasant system had no single point of failure. The hearth provided ambient heat. Banked coals ensured fire never died. Heated peat blocks provided portable warmth. Layered redundancy. If this practical knowledge is valuable to you, hit that like button. It helps this information reach others who need it. I am grateful you are here learning with me. Section 4. Why modern systems fail when medieval peat succeeded. February 2021. Texas, a polar vortex. Electricity demand surges as people try to heat homes. At the same time, gas, coal, nuclear and wind units shut down due to frozen equipment and fuel delivery failures. The grid operator orders widespread blackouts to prevent total system collapse. The result? 4.5 million customers lose power, some for 72 hours or more. Official reviews link the deaths directly to the storm, with economic losses in the tens of billions. The cruel irony? Most of those homes had natural gas lines. Gas was available, but modern central heating systems require electricity to function. Electric ignition, electric fans, electric thermostats. No electricity means no heat, even with fuel available. This is single point of failure design. The entire system depends on one input. When that input fails, everything fails. Medieval peat systems had no dependencies, no power grid, no gas pipeline, no supply chain. The fuel came from the bog, a few hundred yards from the house. The harvesting required muscle power. The ignition required flint or a coal from a neighbor's fire. Once burning, it required nothing but time. Modern survival guides recommend specific preparations for winter power outages: portable propane heaters, generators, battery banks, firewood stockpiles. All valid strategies, but all require external inputs. Propane must be delivered. Generators need gasoline. Batteries eventually drain. Even firewood requires a saw, an axe, and accessible trees. Compare this to the medieval peat user. The bog regenerates slowly, 1 millimeter per year, but for subsistence use, the supply would last thousands of years at the household scale. A single family could harvest an entire winter's fuel in 10 to 14 days of hard work. Once harvested and dried, that fuel wouldn't spoil, wouldn't evaporate, wouldn't degrade. It would sit in the peat stack until needed. The reliability was consistent. As long as you did the work, you had heat. No corporation could cut you off. No storm could disrupt delivery. No price spike could make it unaffordable. This is resilience, not comfort, not convenience, but guaranteed function. During the Texas crisis, some residents rediscovered old techniques. They heated bricks in gas ovens, then wrapped them in towels for bed warmth. They closed off unused rooms. They layered clothing indoors. They burned furniture when firewood ran out. These are not peat-specific techniques, but they follow the same logic. Use what you have, store thermal energy, create redundancy. The lesson is not that everyone should heat with peat. The lesson is understanding why peat worked, reveals why our systems are fragile. Modern heating is optimized for efficiency and convenience. In normal conditions, it's superior. A thermostat set to 68 degrees Fahrenheit, 20 Celsius, maintains perfect temperature with no effort. But that optimization creates fragility. The system only works within narrow parameters: grid power available, fuel delivered, equipment functioning, weather within design limits. Step outside those parameters and the entire system collapses instantly. Medieval peat heating was optimized for reliability. It was less efficient. Open hearths lose 80 to 90% of heat up the chimney. It was less convenient. Someone had to harvest, dry, stack, carry, and maintain the fuel. But within the parameters that mattered, survival in extreme cold without external support, it worked consistently. A 2016 study by Arctic University of Norway used thermal imaging on a replica 14th century dwelling. In -10 degrees Fahrenheit, -23 Celsius, minus heat loss was measured at 3,200 BTUs per hour with no peat fire. With a properly maintained peat fire in the central hearth, the dwelling maintained an interior temperature of 45 to 55 degrees Fahrenheit, 7 to 13 Celsius. Not warm by modern standards, but survivable indefinitely. The same study found that with additional techniques, snow banking the north wall, communal sleeping, layered clothing, the effective temperature rose to 60 to 65 degrees Fahrenheit, 16 to 18 Celsius. Comfortable enough to sleep, to eat, to work on indoor tasks. And this could be sustained for months using only local resources and human labor. The medieval peasant was not living in luxury, but they were living winous generation after generation through winters that would kill unprepared modern families in days. If you're seeing why independence matters more than efficiency, subscribe. This channel exists because of viewers like you. Thank you for being here. Section 5. The Forgotten Mathematics of Survival. Medieval peasants couldn't write differential equations, but they understood heat, fuel, and time. A family of 5 in a northern European winter needed to maintain livable temperature for roughly 120 days, from November to March. The average peasant dwelling was small, perhaps 400 to 600 square feet, about 37 to 56 square meters. Single-room construction, with thatched roof and walls of wattle and daub, woven sticks plastered with mud, to maintain 50 degrees interior temperature in -20-degree weather, requires approximately 360,000 BTUs per day. Total heat required equals roughly 43 million BTUs for the entire winter. Dried peat at operational moisture content provides about 4,300 BTUs per pound. To generate 43 million BTUs requires roughly 10,000 pounds of peat, 5 tons, or about 4.5 metric tons. That sounds like an enormous amount, but context matters. A family of 5 able-bodied peasants working together could cut, dry and stack 5 tons of peat in 10 to 14 days of hard labour. This work happened in late spring and early summer when temperatures were moderate and the bogs were accessible but not waterlogged. Once the peat stack was built, it represented a guaranteed energy reserve. No monthly bills, no price fluctuations, no dependency on delivery. The energy density per unit of labour was favourable, far better than wood in treeless regions. One person could carry 50 pounds, about 23 kilograms of peat per trip. At 4,300 BTUs per pound, that's 215,000 BTUs per load. The peasants understood this intuitively. They didn't calculate BTUs, but they knew how many peat blocks kept the house warm for how many days. They counted, they planned. A typical day's burning in deep winter required roughly 80 to 100 pounds, 36 to 45 kilograms. 120 days times 90 pounds equals 10,800 pounds, confirming the earlier calculation. But peasants also practiced fuel efficiency that modern people have forgotten. They didn't heat the entire house uniformly. They heated the area near the hearth. The rest of the dwelling was cooler. People gathered near the fire during waking hours. They slept in the coldest zone, using body heat and insulation. This zoning saved 20 to 30% of fuel. Instead of 10,800 pounds, they might use only 7,500 to 8,500 pounds. They also adapted behaviour to fuel availability. In years when the harvest was poor or weather prevented adequate peat cutting, they burned less. They wore more clothing indoors. They slept longer hours. They confined activity to a smaller heated area. This flexibility is resilience. The system could degrade gracefully, comfort decreased, but survival remained intact. Modern systems don't degrade gracefully. Your furnace either works or it doesn't. There is no partial function. When it stops, heat stops immediately. The medieval peat system could be throttled, reduced, extended, and adapted to conditions. This adaptive capacity made it robust. The fuel itself had additional properties that enhanced survival. Peat ash wasn't waste, it was a resource. Peasants used peat ash as insulation material. Mixed with clay, it created a primitive cement for sealing gaps in walls. Spread on floors, it provided a dry absorbent surface that helped manage indoor moisture. The ash from winter burning could fill dozens of baskets, and all of it was used. Nothing wasted. This is closed-loop system design. The fuel provides heat. The ash provides secondary materials. The process creates no dependency on external inputs. Modern heating is the opposite, open loop. Energy comes from distant sources. Waste heat vents outside. Nothing is recovered or reused. The efficiency of energy conversion may be higher, but the efficiency of system integration is far lower. A modern home using natural gas might consume 900 therms. That's about 90 million BTUs over a similar winter period, twice the medieval requirement. Why the difference? Modern homes are larger, 1,500 to 2,500 square feet is typical. We heat to 68 to 72 degrees instead of 50 to 55. We heat all rooms uniformly instead of zoning. We pay for this comfort with dependency. The gas must be delivered through a complex pipeline network. The furnace must have electricity. The system must be maintained by specialists. When any link breaks, the entire chain fails. The medieval peasant had no such vulnerability. Their system was simple, local, independent, and robust. Section 6. What peat teaches us about resilience. The medieval peat system was not perfect. It was smoky. It was labour-intensive. It required access to bogland. It produced indoor air quality that would horrify modern regulators. Respiratory disease was common, and life expectancy was short, 30 to 40 years. But it worked. For hundreds of years, across entire regions, for millions of people. What made it work was not the fuel itself. Peat is just partially rotted plant matter. The effectiveness was in the system design. First principle, local resources. The fuel came from within walking distance. No supply chain to break. No logistics to fail. Second principle, renewable harvest at the household scale. While peat grows slowly, subsistence use could continue for generations. The extraction rate was far below regeneration rate at the landscape level. Third principle, low-tech processing. Cutting, drying and stacking peat required only hand tools and time. No specialized equipment. No fuel inputs. No factories. Fourth principle, multi-mode operation. Peat could be burned for immediate heat, banked for overnight warmth, or used as portable heat source. Ash had secondary uses. One fuel, multiple applications. Fifth principle, graceful degradation. The system could function at reduced capacity. Less fuel meant less heat, but not zero heat. You could survive on half rations. Modern systems cannot do this. Sixth principle, knowledge transfer. The skills required were simple enough to teach and complex enough to refine over generations. Every peasant child learned by watching, by helping, by doing. These principles are universal. They apply to any survival system: food, water, shelter, energy. Modern survival philosophy often focuses on gear. The best knife, the best fire starter, the best sleeping bag. But gear fails. Gear breaks. Gear runs out of batteries or fuel or consumables. Knowledge doesn't fail. A technique that works continues working. Skills improve with practice. Understanding deepens with experience. The medieval peasant didn't have advanced technology, but they had deep practical knowledge. They understood their environment. They knew what worked and what didn't. They optimized for reliability, not efficiency. Today, we optimize for convenience and efficiency. This creates brittleness. The Texas crisis was not unique. California 2020, planned blackouts during fire season left millions without air conditioning in 100-degree heat. New York 2003, grid failure stranded people in elevators and subway cars. Every highly optimized system eventually hits conditions it wasn't designed for. The solution is not to abandon modern technology. The solution is to layer it with resilient backups. A home with natural gas heating should also have a wood stove or fireplace, something that can function without electricity. A family dependent on grocery delivery should also have food storage, preserved foods, and skills in preservation. This is redundancy. This is resilience. This is what the medieval peasant practiced without thinking about it. They didn't have one heat source. They had peat fire for ambient heat, banked coals for overnight, heated stones for portable warmth, shared body heat for sleeping, and layered clothing for insulation. 5 different heating strategies, all working together, all reinforcing each other. If one failed, 4 remained. The system was robust. We can apply the same thinking today, not by burning peat, but by understanding why peat systems worked. During winter power outages, modern people rediscover these principles by necessity. They learn that closing off unused rooms conserves heat, that layering clothing reduces heating needs, that shared sleeping is warmer, and that heated objects provide portable warmth. These are not new discoveries. They are rediscoveries. The medieval peasant knew all of this and practiced it daily. The lesson is not nostalgia. The lesson is system design. Build your survival systems on principles that don't depend on fragile infrastructure. Use local resources where possible. Develop skills that work with minimal tools. Create layered redundancy. Accept lower efficiency in exchange for higher reliability. This is not primitive. This is sophisticated. The medieval peasant, burning peat in -30 degrees, was not suffering in ignorance. They were surviving reliably through practical knowledge. Their techniques were refined over centuries, tested by the harshest teacher. Penitent failure meant death, success meant survival. What survived to be passed down was what worked reliably, repeatedly, and robustly. We can learn from that, not to live like peasants, but to think like them. When you remove dependency, you gain freedom. When you build skills, you gain confidence. When you create redundancy, you gain security. The peat fire in the medieval hearth was more than heat. It was independence. It was resilience. It was the difference between freezing and surviving. That knowledge is not obsolete. It is more relevant than ever. If this exploration of forgotten survival knowledge is valuable to you, make sure you are subscribed. We are uncovering more ancient systems that could change how you think about resilience and self-reliance. Which principle from the medieval peat system do you think is most important? Local resources, multi-mode function, graceful degradation? Let me know in the comments below. The medieval peasant in the Scottish Highlands faced -30 Fahrenheit with nothing but peat, knowledge and determination. They survived not comfortably, but reliably generation after generation, using what the land provided. In a world where our systems are increasingly complex and fragile, their example matters. Not because we should return to medieval life, but because we should remember what real resilience looks like. Simple, local, reliable, tested by time. We can build that today with modern understanding and medieval wisdom combined. The peat fire burns low and steady. Not dramatic, not flashy, but absolutely dependable. That is what survival looks like. If these principles changed how you think about preparedness, make sure you're subscribed. More forgotten systems coming. Which principle resonated most? Drop it in the comments. I read every one.